is the idea that we can have a membership and a role provider. So again, very similar to let me actually just increase the font size on this a little bit. So very similar to the way we're using this inversion of control to get the contracts for our interface, the iContact DAL, built into the .NET framework, you have the ability to provide implementations for different providers. So the ones that we're working with at the moment, we could look at some of the other ones as well, is we're looking at the membership provider and the role provider. So, the role provider knows how to do things like create a role. The role provider knows how to get all the roles in the system. That's one thing you should have looked at, for the homework. The role provider can, like I said, create a role. The role provider can find out if a user is in a particular role. The membership provider is basically tasked with information about logging the user into the system. So there's a username, there's a password, there's an email address. And a lot of the aspects of the provider are configurable. So if you look at the config file, you'll see that you have information about how the password needs to be set, whether or not you're going to ask for a username and password, and this sort of thing. Hey. And so we're just downloading the start from Class 8, and we're going to go over it. So again, it's a little bit different. Instead of things being programmed against an interface, they're actually programmed against an abstract class. So if you're going to go and actually look at the membership class, you could actually find out membership C#. So there's a membership class, and at least the class, at least from system. Let's take just a quick look here. Let me look at my web config. Because one thing you could do here is if you look at the classes that you're using to create these users. So if you look at membership and you say go to right click and say go to definition. So it's actually a static class, but within this class, there's a membership provider. So this is a static class, and this class knows how to find your implementation of the membership provider. And I'm pretty sure what you're programming against, I think the class that you're implementing, the membership provider, if we look at this, membership provider, this is an abstract class. So the difference between an abstract class and an interface is the abstract class might have some implementation there already. And I guess the other thing is you might not have to implement everything within that class. So one of the things you could do is you could look at some other providers that are available. I know that there's an XML provider. I can maybe even get you a copy of it. There's also a provider that works with an Access database. I know sometimes you run into some problems with SQL Server. You just want to test something out. You could also use an Access database and get just about the same results. So, again, this is the nice thing about this is that if you looked at your code's not assuming any particular provider, and if you went back in here, you could swap out a different membership provider fairly easily without changing your code. The same way that we could go in and we can swap out our implementation by putting in another class that implements, iContact DAL. It's pretty much the same thing. So the assignment that I wanted to do here was to just try to pop it up here. So the homework for last week, we've got this application. It's got a number of different controllers. It's got a number of different views. In essence, it's allowing us to do CRUD operations with this contact class, but also giving us some more functionality where we could edit, we can delete, we can insert contacts, but we also have a page where we can add multiple contacts at the same time. Our class ends up has some validation properties that we're setting, and we also looked at last week basically giving a link to SQL implementation so we could actually use a SQL Server database. So the homework that I had for this, if this opens up, so it was basically to have a, let's make the text a little bit bigger here. So what I was looking to do is on our contact page to integrate this, this membership provider with our contact class and say, hey, look, we have these contacts in our system. How can we go and create a user using the membership provider? How can we add users to roles using the membership provider? Excuse me, using the role provider. And again, we ended up looking at this last week. So the thing that this becomes an assignment of how you end up integrating this within, within the context of an MVC application, right? So the way that I thought about it, I always sort of take a step back and think about how will my model change, right? What will be the changes in my model if I want to add this functionality, okay? Because one of the things that I try to avoid, even though it's not the end of the world to do it, but one of the things that I would try to avoid is to directly use the membership or the role provider in my view, okay? You could use it. There's nothing that says you can't use it. But the fact is that you don't necessarily need it, right? If you give your model the information that it needs, it doesn't need to query the membership provider. And the fact of the matter is that if it doesn't need to query the membership provider, you have the ability to have a whole different implementation at some point if you want to. I think to some degree it also makes writing your views a little bit easier because you have all the information that you need. Now there is going to be some logic that's in there because there are some columns we're going to show. There's going to be based upon what the role of the currently logged in user is. So the way that I started to think about this, just going back and thinking about the model, the way that I thought about it is what I really need to do is for the contacts that I'm looking at, I need to capture really two pieces of information for each of those contacts. Whether or not they're a user in our system, okay, and what roles they have in our system. So I think a thing that works pretty well with this, if you don't really want, you don't have to necessarily go out and create any new classes here. But so I ended up changing my contact list view model. Okay, and so some of this stuff was already here and works perfectly fine. I've got a list of contacts. I've got a current page. I've got a max page. Right. This is the one that ends up doing the paging for us. And what I did here is I set I've got a private member here that's going to be a dictionary. Okay. Now you can sort of think about this. The key to the dictionary is going to be the username. Okay. And the list of strings is going to be the roles that they have. Okay. And if the user is not a user in the system, I won't even end up putting them in this dictionary. So when I end up calling this for the first time, I just do this sort of lazy loading it. When I call this property, okay, if this private dictionary doesn't exist, I end up creating it. I end up then returning it, okay, and this is my set for it, where I end up basically setting the value for that dictionary. I also have another property because the other thing that I want to have is I want to be able to have a list of all the roles that are in the system. And so I have a property called all roles. Okay, and again I have this private variable list of strings. Same thing, just a little bit of lazy loading. When I go to access this property, if it doesn't have it, I set it to an empty list of strings. I then end up returning it, and this is the set accessor for it. So you don't necessarily have to do it this way, but in the end, these are values that I'm going to end up using in my view. The other thing is that I want to specify whether or not the user is an admin in the system. So, if you look at this, there's no logic really in this model, right? This model basically is just holding information. It's up to my controller, right, to populate this model, right? You just sort of think about it, it sort of makes sense, right? My controller is sort of the brains behind everything. My controller is going to get the request. My controller is going to populate this model, okay? And my controller is going to say, here's the view, use this model for the view. just looking at this model, if you had this model, this is something that's kind of interesting. If you had this model, you could actually go and create your view, right? There's nothing that prevents you from creating the view with this model. I mean, you don't even have to look at the controller to create this view. I mean, if all these things end up, make sense to say, all right, I'm going to have somehow, some way, my controller is going to get a list of contacts, right? Somehow it's going to find out the current page. Somehow it's going to find out the max page. Somehow it's going to get a dictionary, right? The keys to the dictionary are going to be the users that currently exist as users in the system, okay? And the value is going to be a list of strings, which are going to be the roles that each of those users have, right? I have a list of roles, right? And I have whether or not the user is an admin. So if I end up going down and sort of working a little bit backwards here, if I go and I look at the view itself, inside of contact, there's some commented code here that we'll take a look at in a second when we start, doing today's lesson and we start looking at Ajax. But for the most part, right, I want it to basically, not show these edit and delete links unless the user is an admin, okay? And, one way of sort of thinking about this, a way of sort of saying this is not saying whether or not the user is an admin, right? A way you might be thinking about this is to say whether or not this model has the isAdmin property set to true, right? I think it's very, very helpful with MVC, right? To think about what your functionality is, and then to go back and see how you could go back and construct the model, okay? Because you could write MVC applications without doing it, and you could put stuff in the view bag where you don't necessarily need the model. But if you end up thinking about this, literally you could go and do the majority of the work, right, without even having written the controller. And you could have a dummy controller that you end up populating whatever data that you want from it, and pop up the view and see if the view makes sense that you end up getting. Does that sort of seem reasonable, right, with MVC to sort of think along the lines of what the model is for the view, because you're going to have it, at some point, right? And these things, to some degree, are, the view is kind of dumb, right? All the view does is get the model, right? Doesn't make sense creating the view first. But the model's sort of, almost really independent, right? The controller's going to have to create it, but it's almost independent, really, of the controller, right? So if you end up going and taking a look at this view, you'll see that now it's using the new model, right? Actually, the model didn't change. I just changed the properties on the model. So, if the user's an admin, right, I put this action link in here. I did run into some issues with these links. Sometimes the way that the razor ends up getting processed, you could run into some situations where it's not quite breaking things up correctly. I find in that scenario, if I have something like an action link, if I wrap a span around it, it solves that problem. I'm sure there's a way to avoid it, by the way.
I was into that too.
Yeah, I know there's a way to avoid that. I think basically a way of maybe having the @ symbol or putting parentheses around something or brackets around it. But this is...
It's interesting. Something that would work fine outside of an if statement does not work inside.
I know. I saw the exact same thing. thing. I don't know if you ended up solving it by putting a span around it, but that breaks things up.
I did something silly, and I just forced a blank in there.
Right.
I put a bold, put a blank. And then
yeah, that's the same thing. Same exact thing. We'll end up breaking it up. So everything else is the same as what we had before. Okay. Now some of this stuff, I'm going to get at why I'm doing some of this stuff. I'm actually creating as I'm looping over my members, my contacts. Each contact has an ID, and I'm using this. This is purely code that's being output in the browser. I'll tell you why I'm using this in a bit. Right now, I don't need it, but I am going to need it at some point in the future. So I sort of took a step back and took stuff away that we're going to add in tonight's class. So this is all not that important for what we're looking at here. I actually have a big if statement here that says, hey, look, if the model is an admin, okay? So if the model is an admin, and then to pretty much find out whether or not the user exists in the system, I look at the model, I look at this this dictionary, and I see whether or not the keys contains an item.username to lower. Okay? And you'll see when I end up creating this dictionary, I'm always taking the contact username and I'm putting it to lowercase. So if it exists in the dictionary, okay, when I create this dictionary, if the user exists right in the system, I'm going to add that key to the dictionary. If they have no roles, I'll have an empty list of strings for the role property. But if they won't have a key unless they're in the system. That's my way of evaluating whether or not they're in the system. This way I don't have to necessarily stick the membership provider in here, and I could limit the logic that I have in here, right? I could test this out independently, really, of what my provider is. So then I'm going to loop over all the roles in the system, right? And now I'll say, hey, look, if, in fact, the model.username roles with the username, if it contains the role, okay, I'm going to put a span in here. I'm going to put a class that says you're in the role, and I'm going to put an action link here with the name of the role. The action is going to be remove user from role. The controller is going to be contact. Okay? And I'm going to pass some other parameters here to say, hey, look, the role that I'm going to be using is the role. The user ID, which I'm also going to need, is going to be the item ID. And the other thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to keep the user on the current page. So I'm going to pass the page back there as well. Okay? The user ID, I'm actually not going to... the user ID, no, for sure, I'm going to end up needing the user ID because that's going to have to find out what user I'm basically dealing with. And I've got some HTML properties, remove user from role. I have a class, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which is basically a CSS class. You need the @ symbol there because class is a reserved word.
I just barely remembered you mentioning that. It's like, class, how come this isn't working?
Right. You do it once and you sort of realize it, right? And user ID, I'm going to show you why I'm going to end up using that. That's going to come into effect when I end up basically Ajaxifying this page. So basically I'm looping over, I'm finding out if the user exists in the system, I'm looping over the roles. If they don't have the role, I put a link in that says, basically here's the same name of the role, add user to role, again, contact controller, and I'm pretty much passing the same information, right? If they're not in the system, I have an action link that says create account, right? And the only thing that I'm passing is basically in this case, it's really my contact ID. Should probably even call that contact ID because that's really what that ID is, right? They don't exist in the system. I'm going to use that contact ID. If I have that contact ID, then I can get the username and I can get the email address and I can end up adding them to the system. So that's pretty much the logic that's going to end up generating the view, right? Again, you're going to have to create these. There are three. I'm going to have to modify my list action, right? I'm going to have to create an action for create account, add user to role, remove user from role. Okay. So again, I like the idea that I can sort of limit the amount of logic that's here, and you could probably go a step further and pull some of this stuff out into a partial control to have it even cleaner. But it's fairly clean here. There's not a lot of stuff that's going on here. Again, if anything could sort of mess you up and just getting used to the Razor syntax and how that works. If I go back to the controller and I look at the contact controller and I look at the list method, a lot of the stuff is exactly the same. I modified it a little bit by actually creating the model up front here. So I've got, here I've got my page size, right? I've got my my current page is being passed in here. Okay, my max pages I'm gonna end up computing. So here's my logic. I end up getting my contacts. These are basically just the contacts that are page where I'm skipping some and I'm taking what the page size is. Let me actually just turn on word wrap here for a second. So the big change that's here is that there's some other properties here. All roles is a real easy one, right? Model.allRoles, roles, get all roles. And the only thing is that this is an array of strings. If I want to have it as a list of strings, just say toList on an array, and now it's a list of strings. You could have probably kept it as an array as well. Model is admin. Roles is user. Enroll with the admin role. Again, the other thing about that that's kind of nice is that if you were sort of peppering all that logic within your view, and you kept on putting in, whatever it is, membership is user enroll, admin, okay? That string admin is going to be hard-coded. In my case, I only have it really once over here. So if the name of this role ended up changing, you could end up changing it. But again, my model is not, is not dependent upon any provider at all, any membership provider, any role provider. So I'm then looping over all my contacts, right? I shouldn't say all my contacts, basically the contacts that are going to show up in that view. And here I say, hey, membership, get user, right? Contact.username, right? If it's not equal to null, right? If I could find the user. And then what I say is, if I can find the user, model.username roles, add contact.username, just so I don't have a case sensitivity thing here, because with a dictionary, there's going to be some case sensitivity with the key. I think we've seen that before. So here, basically, I just take the username, put it to lowercase, and now I can say, hey, roles, get the roles for a particular user, the contact.username to list. It's actually interesting to note, when you get a user, I don't think that this is case sensitive, right? I don't think that you could have the same user with an uppercase and lowercase name, although you could test that out. I think you'll find out that that's going to be, that's really not going to be an issue. But with my dictionary, it is going to be an issue. So once I do that, now I have my dictionary, right? And again, my dictionary says that if you have a key, you're a user, okay? The value is going to be your list of roles in the system. So I've got my model.contacts, I've got my model.currentPage, my model.maxPages. This is the same as we had before, okay? And I return the view, that's the model. And that's about the extent of displaying this stuff, right? We still have to add our actions to add a user to a role and that sort of thing. So if I say debug, let's actually do the Omar trick here. Put an HTML page in. There's got to be an easier way to do this. But I'm going to go in here and say browse with. And let's say Firefox, set as default, browse. I don't know why it's taking so long to load here. But there it is, it's loaded. And now if I go back here and I say debug, start without debugging. Here's my page. All this stuff is stuff from before. If I go to contacts, right, you'll see that you can't see this. And I should probably hide this column as well, right? I actually changed this to put more items on one page because one of the things we're going to do later on is that when we start editing these things, if we don't use Ajax, we're going to go right back to the top. We're going to use Ajax, and we'll stay in whatever position we're in on the page. We'll make an Ajax request to add a user to a role, to remove a user from a role, and to go in and actually create a user. So if I look at the contacts, all the other stuff is the same from last week. If I log on, right, and we'll pick Feynman again, password. So I'm logged in. It actually will allow me to log out as well. If I go to contacts, now I see these users and roles. So what I did here is I set a class. If you're in the role, it's green. If you're not, it's not green. If you mouse over these things, it also gives you some indication, remove from role and add to role. Okay? And if a user doesn't exist, there's a lot of users that don't exist, I could go and create the user. Okay? And we'll look at these methods that end up creating the user and that sort of thing. But if I go to create an account here, it'll stay on this page. And I also have a little handy message by using my temp data that says that, you know, the user's been created. I could add a user to a role. Tells me this account has been added to the admin role, right? Added to the super duper role, removed, removed. Okay. So the next thing we'll do, and these actually the other actions here are really well, I shouldn't say that they're not that minimal. Some of them are not that minimal, but there's not a ton that's really going on here. Okay, so let's start with the creating the account. This is commented out. I'm going to put it in later on because one of the things that I'm doing here, which is probably not the best idea, is this idea of making changes to data with a GET request, right? And the theory is that you just want to avoid doing that. You know, if you're going to be changing data in the system, you should probably end up doing a post to change data. And what we're doing here is always a post, and then we're redirecting and we're making a GET request. So we wind up with a GET request, unless of course there's some problem with our data and that sort of thing. So if we look at the create account, okay, I'm passing in the page, okay, and I'm going to pass in the user ID, okay. Again, if we go back to our view, how does the page get added in? If you end up looking at this this action link where we're creating the user, right? Create account. The action is create account. It's contact, and all you have to do here is say what else do you want to pass, okay? And I'm going to pass a user ID. I have the contact's ID, and I also have the page as well, right? It's the model's current page. Think about that. If you look at how these links end up getting created, not that it really matters one way or the other, okay? So what's happening here, it's using create account, and it's just tacking these on to the URL string when you go to create the account, okay? If for some reason we had a routing configuration to deal with this scenario, it would give you the correct link for that route. Again, we don't have anything specific for the create account, so this is what it ends up giving you. If we look at this action, create account, we get our logic class, okay? We've passed in a user ID. I should probably name this a little bit better. This is actually the contact that you're getting here, okay? And I'm doing this membership create status, and I'm creating a user, right? I'm getting the user's username, putting in password as the password, getting the user's email, and this is again how the membership provider is set up. This is null, and I think this is this overloaded method ends up giving the user the ability to log in. And I just have this. There shouldn't be a reason why I shouldn't be able to create the user, because in my system, the only thing that I really need to get at this point is going to be the username. The only scenario I could think of is that if the username exists, but that's not all that likely in this case because, in fact, our usernames in our system are unique, right? And if the account exists, you're not going to end up being able to get to this action. And we could add some other restrictions on that as well. But once I'm able to, so I don't expect to have a problem here. I just have a message here that I'm putting in temp data. Again, temp data, what it does, which is kind of nice, is I can redirect back to an action, okay? So if you ended up taking this, for instance, and putting it in view data or that sort of thing, it would end up being lost when you ended up redirecting. And again, the way that this works behind the scenes is that this is put in the session, okay? The first time that it's read, it's wiped out from the session. So you don't really have to worry about managing the data in the session. You're basically just using this to display some information on the page. And all this is, you can put whatever you want to in temp data. Again, you don't want to, these things are not strongly typed. So it's not like, I know last week I put a list of contacts in there, and it's legitimate to do that. But you kind of want to avoid doing stuff like that because then when you take it out, you're going to have to cast it as whatever it needs to be cast as. Here I'm just putting in a string, and so I'm going to redirect to action, and I go back to list, and I say new page is equal to whatever page was passed in there. And the thing that you can see about this is that when I create the account, if you look at the URL, right, the URL gets properly written back, right? It takes me back to page 7. And you can look at this sort of thing. One thing that you might want to do here, I don't have it on here, I should probably, everybody should install this. Firebug, and just so you can see that it's a post and then it's a GET request, I'm going to install this. Click on this guy. Shut some of these down. So with Firebug, I'm going to enable it. And if I go to this, anywhere on this page, I'll go up to page 9. And so if I look at this create account, what I'm going to see is right now it's doing a GET request. Okay? That's one thing that I'm going to get rid of in a second. It's doing a GET request. It's basically passing all the data that it needs to create this user account on the URL string. Okay? And then it's doing a redirect, right, where it's redirecting back to this page 9. Okay? Now again, this is going to set up. This is going to be set up pretty nicely when we end up doing our post and we end up redirecting back to our GET request. So this is our create account method. If we look at adds user to role, the only additional thing that we're passing here is going to be we're passing in the page, we're passing in the user ID, we're passing in the role, and you can see this. If you mouse over one of these, you could look and see what the URL is, right, where you're calling the add user method. Right, if I look at this URL, right, this is contact add user to role, and it's basically just passing these other parameters. Again, if I had a route for these parameters, then it would end up creating that link according to that route. Right now, it's just using the default route in order to do this, which basically means, hey, look, what I'm going to end up doing is creating this link by using the controller, using the action, and I'm just going to pass whatever parameters you give me on the URL string as parameters.
So is there ever, when is it ever necessary to bother creating a route?
It's vanity, right? That's what it is. I mean, if you want the URL to have a certain look to it, that's why you would end up creating the route.
You want a pretty URL.
Yeah, pretty URL. I mean, there's other scenarios that you could sort of think of where, you could have routing that disguises. Yeah, I mean, I think in the end it's vanity. I mean, you could have, URLs that in essence, that parse out however you want them to parse out. I mean, ours has an ID at the end, gets the action, has the controller. If you wanted to, you could put the ID in the middle. I mean, I've seen things online where people want to create subsites with MVC, and they sort of do it with a routing configuration.
But fundamentally, routing is not required, basically, essentially.
The only reason why it's required with MVC is to get the action in the controller, right? That it has to know how to do, right? Because you have to have some starting point. I mean, I guess theoretically, it could be set up so you go to the default page and you have on the URL string what the action and the controller are. But the URL is going to look pretty nasty in that case. So if we take a look at the add user to role, here's my logic. Again, I'm saying I should probably name this contact instead of user. Okay? And now I'm getting my actual membership user, membership get user, user.username, roles.add user to role, member user, username, and role. Okay? And here's my message, user account for user.username has been added to this particular role. And again, I end up redirecting to action to go back to the page that I was on. Right, the other thing that I put in here, I think we actually even might have spoken about this. I'm also putting an authorization on here so that if you're not logged into the system, right, there's an authorize that says that if you're not in the admin role, you're not going to be able to access this controller. Again, accessing a view doesn't really give you anything because the views are inherently dumb. It's the controllers that need to be locked down. and you can't access a view directly, right? The views end up getting access through the controllers. When you want to remove a user from a role, here's the logic. You end up getting the user based upon the user ID, okay? Membership user, we end up getting the membership user, and the roles provider, or what I should actually say is the roles class, okay, which has access to a roles provider, right? If we looked at this roles class, go to definition, we would see that the roles class has a role provider, okay? And, again, based on what the configuration is, the role providers collection ends up getting set. Again, this is actually done through there's going to be some method that allows this to happen. Again, this is all done pretty much internally. And you could look at it. I mean, all the providers that you have, I forget about the class where this stuff is being loaded, but you have the ability to create your own type of provider pattern as well. So if you end up looking at this remove user from role, right, this pretty much does the same thing as the other ones. And what this sort of leaves us with, is again, you have the ability to create the account. You have your messaging that's there. And you could add users to roles and remove them from roles pretty easily. And you also have this editing and deleting. Again, that's only set up if you're logged to the system. Again, I log out, and I go here. I don't end up seeing those links. Right?
Oh, where on the list view does it inject the temp data?
Oh, that's actually a good question. It's a great question. It's not on the list view.
Right.
And usually I end up putting this, since all these pages are using, again, with the Razor view engine, it's not called a master page, but it's this shared layout page. Where I have this ID message, and that's why it shows up red. If you look at the style sheet, that's actually the same why that if you're in a role, it shows up green, because I have a property called a CSS class called isRole, which has a green color. So here, message is red, and that's where the temp data shows up. It's actually kind of interesting too. The way that this works is that if this is null, it doesn't throw an error. It just doesn't do anything, right? So if I looked at this, if I looked at the output here, like there's no message here.
Right.
If I ended up viewing the page source, I would see the yeah, right here. So it's empty, and it's not really that big a deal. If you wanted to, you could put down something that says, hey, look, if temp data is not equal to null, then show that div if for some reason that div was screwing up your page in some way, right? So that's kind of a helpful thing, because you might want to put messages there on the page. And again, we'll see how we end up Ajaxifying this site, which is kind of an interesting
But that's
thing.
kind of like a little hack that you could use in a 1,000-page website, or whatever. You just kind of like, I'm just going to stick a message on this page or whatever, and it's just going to be there because it's in the shared view. You can just kind of use that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty common thing to do this kind of messaging thing. So I think it's, if it's there, it'll end up using it. If you wanted to do a different message on this page, you could end up saying, having a temp, putting in temp data, a specific message, and put it on this view wherever you want to put it. You could also do that. So yeah, if you don't want it to show up on the top in red, you don't have to, put it in that, set it in the temp data with that particular key. Okay. Any questions so far?
Yeah. Could you go out to the controller?
Mm-hmm.
In your add user to role method, I'll use that as an example. I notice you take the extra step to assign a membership user ID before doing the add user to role. Is that necessary?
No, I'm not assigning a membership ID. I think the reason why I'm doing this, let's see, what is the rationale for doing this? Do you have to do it? You know what I think? You know why I think I wanted to do this? Is that I just wanted to pass the user. I just wanted to pass the contact ID. I mean, I could have passed the username in here too. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
No. In fact, when the cursor's blinking right now, you're actually calling membership get user
Mhm.
with the username, which you have already.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
And you're assigning it to a variable, and you're using that variable again. And my question is, I don't think you have to.
I don't think I have to. I think you're probably right. I mean, if for some reason there wasn't a user in the system, this would catch it. But I think you're 100% correct.
Okay.
Let's see. But is there a reason why I'm using it? Am I using something? No. In this case, I'm not. You know what I did? I needed it here because I needed the email address. You're 100% correct.
Right, okay.
Here I needed it because I needed the email address. You're 100% correct. I could take, this could easily come out, and this could just be the user dot username,
Okay.
which would be totally fine.
Okay.
And one less call to the database, which is also perfectly fine as well. Yeah, that's a good call.
Okay. And my second question is my approach to this, as you pointed out, was a little different.
Your approach was that if they didn't have the account, I'm assuming you created the account and then added them to the role at the same time, right?
Well, yeah, but I'm actually taking a step further back than that. Even. I decided to put all of these additional properties in the contact class instead of a model class because I guess I was thinking like SQL. A contact has roles that he can perform in the database. A contact is or is not an administrator.
You could do it. I mean,
Is it better to do it one way over the other?
Well, it just depends on what your application is. I mean, my case, this was a little bit of a stretch to say, look, if this was an application where basically we wanted to store names and addresses of our friends or something, or our customers or whatever, right? I mean, you could make the case that they're two different things, right? You could say, customer can have the ability to log into the system, but you might not give them the ability to log in the system. So I think the reason why I wouldn't put it in the contact is not every contact is going to end up having a user account, right? They don't have to have a user account.
Right, and then I set that property to null, or I set it to something to
right.
indicate that.
I mean, there's a little bit, by the way, there is something that's duplicate. There's some duplicate data here, right? Because we could actually screw things up a little bit, possibly, because we're sort of syncing this username and creating a new user that basically a membership user. Right? We have a contact. We're creating a user from the contact. That's what we're doing, and we're using the same username that the contact has as the username for the member. Right? We could go back in there after that and then edit that particular contact. I don't know exactly what that would end up, whether it would break the system or just, we'd have at that point? We'd have an orphaned user in the system.
Right.
So, there could be some way of needing to sync these things if that's something that you want to do. I mean, one thing you could do is say, if the username ends up changing, maybe you could have some way of updating a username in the system, although I'm not clear right off the bat if the membership provider allows you to edit the username so fast. I'm not sure about that. There are some systems where you can't really change the username. Once the username is set, it's set, right?
Right, kind of in a similar vein. I think I stuck all my logic in the account controller.
I saw that, right?
The contact controller. I was kind of like, well, look, it's a member. This member stuff is all static anyway. It's like this thing that's already there. But I wasn't, it was kind of arbitrary.
I mean, the reason I stuck it in here, right? The model for me, the main thing that sort of jumps out at me is that my model makes sense for what I'm trying to do, right? My model makes sense for my view, right? So that's the first part. The second part of where you put the other things, I would say that in the end, if it's the contact controller that I'm on, and I'm in essence, I'm not that I'm modifying contacts, but I'm creating a user account from a contact. I didn't have this logic anywhere else, so, I went ahead and put it in this controller. I mean, don't forget, by the way, if you were on another, well, you would have to modify your logic in a way. I mean, if you were on another part of the application and you wanted to create a user account, a different way, again, in this case, you're redirecting to a list, you could pass a parameter to determine where you should end up, redirecting to if you wanted to do that. Or you could pull this stuff out. You're right. You could pull it out in the static class and that static class could do nothing more than, you could have a static class that says, create user, add user to role, remove user from role, and you could actually take it one step further and sort of say, not even program a little bit less directly against the role provider and the membership provider. You could say, hey, look, I'm going to have some class that has the ability to create a user. I'm going to have some class that has the ability to add a user to role, to remove a user from role, and you can have these wrap around the membership provider and the role provider if that was something that you wanted to do. I mean, I've seen again, I haven't done a lot of unit testing, but I know that sometimes the fact of the matter is, the fact that the membership class is a static class and the role class is a static class makes it sometimes difficult to do testing or to mock some of these things. Again, I haven't really run into it. That's something that I'm gonna have to take a look at in the future. But that might be a reason for wrapping around a role provider, wrapping around a membership provider.
I actually went a little bit beyond the homework, and I tried to program.
Don't brag.
The user ID. No, I'm not. But I ran into issues.
What was the issue?
Trying to do that, and it turns out I'm not the only one who's seen it. But the issue is the code runs, but it doesn't do anything.
What were you trying to do?
I was trying to delete a user account.
It's interesting.
And there's a parameter that we've supplied to what I guess delete user, where you supply the username to delete, and then a Boolean true, meaning get rid of anything.
Oh yes.
And the code runs beautifully, and it comes out of the code. You go back, look in the database.
Even when you pass that Boolean value,
even when I pass that Boolean value.
That's interesting.
And if you go to Stack Overflow, you'll see other people have that same.
So what was there? How did they resolve it? Did they hit the database directly?
Some people created stored procedure to do the deletions table by table.
It's an interesting thing because one thing you could do if you wanted to. It's an interesting dilemma, right? But one thing you could do is to have, because you should be able to delete. I know I've deleted membership users before, so there is definitely a way to do it, right? I mean, one thing that you can do is you can, run profiler and see on that step when it deletes the user why it's not deleting the user. To take a look and see what's being called. Again, give you some insight into what tables are being called or what's missing with that. But I definitely have done that where I have been able to delete a user from the system. So I know it's possible, but I don't know. Maybe there's some combination of things.
Or sending, I had a lot of trouble getting my
I know that.
Set up
Right.
So it could certainly be something related to that.
And when I went back to yours, I had to change your config settings to have because I wasn't using.
To go back
SQL
to
Server.
Right. I left them there.
Right. Yeah, I figured that. It'd be nice if you changed it before you sent it to me, but not a big deal. All right. So if we look at this, one couple of things that jump out is this idea that when we end up going in, one thing in particular is when we go to create an account, that it's actually a GET request, right? That's something that would be nice to avoid. Now, one thing you could do right off the bat, right? We could, if our, hey, how you doing? If our desire is to, only allow these changes when we're posting, we could comment this post attribute out. Now this is going to break. And again, the theory here is that if you're changing data, you don't want someone to be able to, get to a link where you could end up, just by clicking on a link, deleting the data. That's the theory at least behind it. But it's also just, just a little bit of a flag to say, you know what, this is a post. There's a chance that I'm, deleting some data here. If I go to build this, when I go into create account, right? So, it's an important thing here. I'm making a GET request. It says the resource can't be found, right? And that's accurate, right? Because creating an account says that this can only be called. So this action is tied to a post. Right? If this action is tied to a post, then right now it doesn't exist. Okay? So how can we modify it? So I have some notes here that I'm going to be using. I've got a copy of them somewhere here. So I want to do this, even though I could just uncomment stuff to make this change. I want to do it in a couple of steps. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add the following JavaScript to my list. And I'm going to take the part that's actually commented out, and I'm going to paste this little script in here, and we'll talk about it. So what the other thing that we're doing here is getting a little bit more of an exposure to jQuery. And I'm going to take all this code that's commented out, and I'm going to paste this in. Okay? So one thing that you'll notice about all these links that are on my page, is that if you use Firebug or if you went and looked at source code, you'll see all of these have a class called postLink. Okay? This is something that we've ran into before even at work, where we want to actually do a post request when we're changing data, and we've got a hyperlink. I mean, it also, if you want to do a post, and just from the point of view of your UI, you don't want to have a submit button. You want to actually have a hyperlink. You could run into this scenario as well. We want to turn this link right into a post. Okay? Now, it's really a very simple thing to do. What I do is I use jQuery. And just to sort of give a little review of how this works, with jQuery you have the ability to select elements that are on the page. The selection process is the same as the CSS selection process. In fact, there's some, jQuery had built into it, even before the browsers would allow you to do it, is the idea of, even choosing the first element or the last element in a set. But here, this is very simply, this would be the same way that you would specify this link in a style sheet. So the $, okay, the way to think about this $, is that this is working on a wrapped set in jQuery. What this ends up doing is that this is wrapping, it's a wrapped set of DOM elements. Okay? Someone asked me in the HTML5 class, is it just an array? Okay? It's an array plus. Okay? It's an array in the sense that it has a length property. It's an array in the sense that when you iterate over it, you get back your DOM elements. Okay? But it also has additional methods that you could call, which are all the jQuery methods. So if you look at the jQuery documentation, okay, you could take this wrapped set and say hide. You could take this wrapped set and you could say show. So just as a quick example, you could take this out. But if we were to say hide, okay, and I reload this page, I'll see all my links disappear, right? I can see the dot's still here, but all my links end up disappearing. By the way, they're part of the DOM. If I look over here, I'll see here they are, right? I could go in here and see, here are my links, but their style is set to display none. On the same token, right, just to beat a dead horse a little bit, I could say remove. This is going to remove them from the DOM. Okay. Now if I went to look in here, I would see that these are actually empty. They've been removed from the DOM. And again, the point is, you could add any jQuery code to this set. If I said CSS, let's see, CSS, so any CSS property. Let's say, let's say font size. Right, it's kind of silly. But if I went back here and reloaded this, all right, I would say pretty big font size. So again, the first part of attaching events to things is to be able to select them. So the second part here, another thing that you can do with jQuery is you could say, hey, look, when anything in this collection, okay, anything in this wrapped set of DOM elements, anytime that it's clicked on, okay, anytime that it's clicked on, what I want to do is call this function. Okay? Now, internally, what this happens is internally within jQuery, right, these are wrapped around DOM elements, and what it's doing is it's attaching to each DOM element an on-click event. It's subscribing to the on-click event of each of these DOM elements with this function. Okay? This is a callback function. Again, you could do this with regular JavaScript, but this is just a little bit easier to do. Now, once I get into this callback function, this is going to get called when these links get clicked on. Okay? So what I'm doing here, I'm going to modify this in a little bit, but what I'm doing here is I'm dynamically generating a form. Okay? And the way that I do that, so the dollar sign can get used another way. Here the dollar sign is used for selection. Okay? And here the dollar sign is actually creating, so jQuery looks at it and sniffs it out and says, hey, look, are these tags that you're giving me? If there are tags that you're giving me, it's basically going to create, you can think about it as an XML fragment. Okay? You can think about it as a DOM element. Okay? It's actually creating a form. Okay? And in essence, it's a form that's internally what it's actually calling is that JavaScript has a method called createElement. The document object has the ability to create an element. You give it a tag, it creates an element, and this is internally what jQuery is using. Okay? You can create as many elements as you want. They'll be in memory. They're not going to end up getting added back to the DOM. Here, what I'm doing is I'm creating the element. Okay? Another thing about jQuery is that things are changed. So once you have a jQuery collection, you can modify that collection. I'm setting an attribute, okay, my action attribute. And what I'm doing here is that when this link gets clicked on, okay, very, very important concept with jQuery, when you get into the event handler, when you have a wrapped set of DOM elements, the event handler that you're subscribing to with that wrapped set, okay, the word this in here, the context, okay, in JavaScript, the word this is the context, is going to end up pointing to the actual DOM element. Okay? So if this was a collection of 50 links, okay, when you end up getting into that callback, this is going to point to that particular link. And again, just to sort of to beat a dead horse a little bit, if I was to go in here and comment out a couple of these things here, right, this is a silly thing to do, but if I wanted to remove that element, I could say $ this. So this is going to point to a DOM element. One thing you can do is you can say alert this, and it's going to tell you. Actually, what it's going to point, since it's a link, it'll actually show you the href property. That's the way that it displays itself. Don't ask me why. But if I go in here, click F5, click on this, it's going to give me the URL. Okay, and it didn't get submitted because I have a return false here. But if I was to say $this, I don't really want to do this. But if I said $this remove, all right, this is going to make the links disappear.
Is there? I forget it. Don't you need to use .each so that
No.
this is each one of them?
Because you're not iterating over the collection. Internally, what might be happening is that when you end up attaching the event handler to it, okay, jQuery might be iterating over your collection of DOM elements and attaching an event handler to them. Okay? But, when this thing gets clicked on, it's only one item that ends up getting clicked on. Again, the event handler is attached to every single element. Okay? You can't click on links simultaneously, right? You can only click on one at a time. So when a link gets clicked on, right, a function is going to get called and you're going to have access to that link. Right? So what I do here is I create this form. Okay? And the next thing that I do is I'm going to do this one step at a time. I do a selection here and I get the body of my page. I'm going to add this form into the body of my page. Okay? I'm going to say append form. It's kind of an interesting thing here because when I do this, and all these fall under different categories. If you look at jQuery, these would probably fall under manipulation of the DOM, because that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm manipulating the DOM. I'm adding a node to the DOM, right? I'm adding this form. So it's kind of interesting here. If I was to do this, and it's nice I have Firebug here. So if I refresh this page and I start clicking around on these, right, nothing's going to happen. But actually, if I scroll up here, inside the body of my page, let me make sure I end up doing that. Body.append form. Oh, you're right. It's not going to be on the end. Thank you. Look at all my form tags, right? So it's just appending these to the end. If I wanted to, by the way, insert them at the beginning.
Is it different URLs each time?
Yeah, because I'm getting the URL from the href of the link that gets clicked on, right? So if I wanted to go in and actually put that at the beginning, not that it really matters one way or the other, I could say, I think that there's a method in jQuery, insert or something. There's probably a number of ways to do it. So if I look at the documentation and I go to manipulation, yeah, so instead of doing append, I could probably do prepend, I think. So if I say prepend, and it doesn't really, for this, it really doesn't make much of a difference at all. Hello. Still raining out? No? If I look at this, and I look at jQuery, excuse me, I look at the DOM, I'm going to see that these forms are going to get added at the beginning. Right? So again, I don't want to keep on doing this. What I really want to do is submit the form. And so I could go and submit the form. And what that does is now, if I reload this page, so again, when I'm changing data, I want to do a post request. Okay? And instead of going in, I mean, the nice thing about this is instead of having a ton of form fields on the page, I could just have links on the page. And in essence, and we had seen this before with the delete link, one way of saying this, I'm basically hijacking the link. Okay, and I'm causing a form submission with the same link. If I was to go and look at this, clear this out, and look at create account, okay, it's making a post, and then it's making a GET request. All right, make this a little bigger here. Right, it's making a post, and then it's redirecting back to page 6. Right, so that's how you would end up. You know, if you had these links and you didn't set this up as a post, it's probably just a good practice to get into if you're going to be modifying data. And again, what you're doing here in the post is, you know, nothing more than changing your data, and then you're doing redirect to action, right, and you're going back to your list.
In doing this assignment, I noticed that there's a, I think it's like technically wrong to put nest forms instead of forms.
Right.
And this page starts out with using begin HTML form, and in this case, you're sticking forms up at the top of the body, so it's not technically doing that. But in the edit and delete, were we doing that before?
I hope not. Let's see where I don't think we are. I think that there is a form that's wrapping around
everything.
Oh, so that's actually incorrect. If that's the case, let's see where that is. Here's a begin form. No, I think this form, if you actually look at the generated HTML, and by the way, the edit and the delete, the edit and the create take you to another page anyway. Right, you're off this page. Right, if you do go to edit,
yeah, that one.
Right, you're no longer on this page. But if you go back to contacts, the form that's here, here's your, we've got that form because we have this this post here that we're using for this input button, which we looked at some point.
Yeah,
So we've got a form that's here, but I think that's the only form that's on the page. When we add the form dynamically, we're adding it all the way at the into the body of the document. Yeah, it's really not. There's not really. I don't know what the impact is, but there's no reason really to have nested forms.
I think we're doing it with the edit and the delete.
With the edit and the delete, I don't.
Because you do have that large one, and if you look at and it doesn't work.
Let's see if it's here. If it's here, it probably shouldn't be here. So we've got a form here, right? And is there another form on this page? Yeah, here these are basically just, they're not nested, right? This is a form that we're wrapping around. I don't think I do it for the edit. I think I do it for the delete. There's a form that's wrapping around this delete link. So I don't think any of them they're not nested inside of other form
I thought there was
elements.
a big giant form.
It looks like it, but if you look at it here, the giant form, I mean, I think one reason you might be thinking there's a giant form is that in web forms, there's always a giant form.
No, I was thinking it because you start out with using...
Right, but its closes here, right?
Maybe.
Right, so that's where the closing form tag goes. Okay. So we've done a little bit of work here using a little bit of jQuery to do our post. All right? And we did the step 2 where we're adding this attribute to make sure that you can only post when you're making these changes. Okay. So let's start to think about how we could go about not reloading the entire page of data, right? One issue here is that if we go up to, we go down here, right? I ended up putting more users on a page just to really demonstrate this, and I create my account here. I end up going all the way back to the top, right? So if I said, hey, I wanted to create the account and then do this, right? See if I got an error message there. User accounts created. Yeah, I keep on going up to the top, right? So one thing we could do is start to think about how we could make an AJAX, turn this into an AJAX request. Now, the method that I'm going to do here, I've heard people use this term donut hole to do this because, and I think the reason why it's described as a donut hole is that I'm going to go back to the server, okay? I'm going to get the entire page back, okay? I'm going to make an AJAX request. I'm going to get the entire page back, okay? But what I'm going to do, instead of using the entire page, I'm just going to pull out the row that ended up getting updated and swap it with the row that's on the page, okay? I mean, really, if you think about it, if I make this change here, what's the only thing that's really changing, right? When I make this change, the only thing that's changing is that, I've modified this particular row, okay? So it's a donut hole because I'm actually going to go and make the same exact post request that I made before. I'm going to still get a lot of data back. Now, you could make the case and say, hey, look, there's a little bit of a waste there. Why am I getting all that data back? That's true, okay? But from the point of view of usability from the user, it's kind of nice because they're not basically going up to the top of the page to basically re-scroll through things again. So how can you go about doing this? Well, I'm going to take, I told you we're actually going to get rid of that inserted form. I'm going to actually modify my post link, okay? And I'm just going to take this entire thing. So this is step 3, Ajaxify it. I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to paste it in. And let's talk a little bit about how this is going to work. Well, one thing that I did here, okay, I didn't actually need to put in. If you look at any of these links here, any of these post links, and you can actually even see it if you view the source code. So if you look at any of these post links, All right, so if you look at any of these post links down here on the page, you could see that they have a user ID attribute. Okay? It's perfectly legitimate to arbitrarily put in attributes. I mean, you might have some situations where where you validate your page, it might tell you this attribute is not a valid attribute, but there's no problem with putting an attribute on a link. If you see all these links, all of them have a user ID attribute. On the same token, you'll see that that user ID attribute, if you go up to the ID of this table cell, and what I should actually even say here, the only thing that really is changing in this case is really this particular table cell. If you look at the attribute, this ID attribute for this table cell, you'll see that it's basically membership, container, and their user ID. If I go down to the next one, right, this is Nina's. User ID is 1,000. 10,000. What are the odds that that would happen? It's crazy, all right? But you'll see that this is the ID for this link, and I actually have the user ID here. Okay? So what I'm going to do, so my logic is going to be, the sort of interesting part of this is that I'm going to go and post, and I'm going to get the new page back. Okay? And again, the new page works. I mean, we tested it out before, right? The new page works, but what I'm going to do is from the entire new page, I'm going to grab this TD element, okay? Because I'm going to have the user ID, okay? And I'm going to, on the current page, I'm going to take this, the existing TD element, and I'm going to replace it with the new TD element, okay? And so again, the reason why it's a donut hole is you have this bunch of data that you're getting back, and you know you're barely using anything, you're just using this small piece. But I have to find out what piece that I want to get back, okay? So what I'm doing here, if you look at the code that I pasted in here, the guy talks so loud, huh? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, first of all, when I click on this link, okay, again, you have a jQuery collection, okay? I'm subscribing to the click event. Inside of this callback function, okay, this is going to point to the DOM element. I just want to grab the user ID, okay? If I wanted to use native DOM methods, I could. I could say this get attribute and get the user ID. For all I know, I could even say this.user ID, but I don't want to deal with that right now. What I'm doing here is I'm wrapping this, so now that I have a jQuery object, with jQuery I can say attribute, give me the user ID attribute. Okay? So I have this ID, which is the user ID. Okay? What I'm going to do here is jQuery has a way to make an AJAX request. I think that this is the first time we're looking, at least in this class, at making an AJAX request. The way that this ends up reading is that this is the first time that we're seeing the $sign, and we don't have a parenthesis after the $sign. Okay? So the $sign is a jQuery method. We could call it a number of different ways, right? We could call it to get a jQuery collection. When we had inserted our form, we created it to dynamically create a form element, okay? But here we just have the $sign and the dot. That's sort of the equivalent of a static jQuery method, okay? We're not operating on any jQuery collection. What we're doing is we're just saying, hey, look, we want to make an AJAX post, okay? Again, well, not again, because I don't know if we've discussed this, but browsers have the ability to make AJAX requests to the server, okay? The browser has the ability to make what's called an XHR request to the server. If you want to get more specific, the browser has the ability to make an XML HTTP request to the server, right? All the modern browsers end up implementing this functionality, okay? And again, jQuery is just, since maybe they implement it a little bit differently, it's a little bit of a pain to use in its native format. Not a huge pain, but this is a lot easier. So if I tell jQuery, hey, look, I want to make a post, okay, it's going to be an XHR request. An XHR request can either be a GET or a POST, just like a regular request. When you end up looking at it in Firebug, it's going to be under the XHR tab, and it's going to show you that it's a POST. I'm going to use the same href that I was using before, okay? And what this is another callback function, okay? So with JavaScript in general, jQuery in particular, you're working with callback functions a lot. Another name for these sort of functions is anonymous functions because they don't have any names to them. But this is a callback function, and when the AJAX request is successful, okay, this is going to give me my data back. Okay? If I look at what this data is, this is going to be my entire HTML page. Okay? This data is going to be my entire HTML page. This is going to be the entire donut. Okay? And what I want to get from that donut is my new data. Okay? And one way that I could use this is I could use the $ again. Okay? And I'm going to use my selector. Okay? I'm going to use my selector, #membership container, and I'm going to put my user ID on it. Okay? But you'll see there's a comma here. Okay? If I didn't end up putting this second parameter here, this would give me the existing one that's on my page. It would look through my current page, okay, and it would give me that one particular cell, the one I clicked on. This is going to actually give me the one that's coming back from the server. Okay? And now what I can actually do here is I could say, hey, look, get the current one, okay, swap it out with the new one.
I never knew about that comma data, comma source, comma whatever. There's a
context. Context, where you want to start looking. Another reason why you'll end up using this even on the same page is that if you know, first of all, I mean, maybe you're looking for a class of elements, but they're in a particular div, okay? You could start at a certain spot, okay? It also makes it a little bit more efficient, I think, when it's going to look for it, but I'm not sure that that's the rationale that you have to use it for. There's a number of ways to get the same result, but this will end up getting them for us, and what this ends up doing here is that when we end up making this change, right, we can go inside here, and now if I scroll down, I say create account, it stays in the exact same spot. If I look at Firebug, okay, if I look at Firebug, and I look at all the requests here, like if I go to add this user to the role, oh, resource cannot be found. Add user to role. Resource cannot be found. Let's see. Should be able to find it. Let's see. Oh! Actually, I think I know why this is happening, but let me... You know, this is actually an interesting... This is, believe it or not, this was planned. I know that you find that hard to believe. But let me actually show you why that's happening. So what ends up happening is that when my page loads, okay? When my page loads, I'm going to reload this whole thing, right? When my page loads, all of my post links, okay? All of my links with the class post link get wired up, okay? All of the links that are post link, hold on one sec, they get wired up, okay? Now, what will happen here, if I went over here and I said, let me go to another page, so I don't want to take Feynman out of the admin role, because then I won't be able to log into the site. But if I was to go in here and click on admin, click on admin, okay? Click on admin, okay? I don't have an error, okay? If I were to go down here and click on create account, I don't have an error, okay? If I go back up here and click on super duper user, I get my error, okay? The key to why that I'm getting that error, if I look at this, I'm making a GET request, okay? I can't make a GET request to that action because that's decorated with the HTTP post, okay? So why did it break? In essence, what ended up happening is that these links were still trying to make a GET request, Okay? And the reason why they were trying to make a GET request is that when I updated my DOM, okay, when I updated my DOM, if you end up replacing DOM elements, okay, your new DOM elements are not wired up. Okay? When you replace your DOM elements, they're not wired up. So there's something that you can do with jQuery that's kind of an interesting thing. Instead of saying click, you could say live or live. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. And a parameter that you're going to have to put in here is going to be click. Okay? And what this says is that, hey, look, from now and into the future, okay, if I end up adding something to the DOM later on with a class of postLink, I want it to get wired up as well. Okay? So one of the problems is that if you're manipulating the DOM and you attach event handlers to elements in the DOM, and then you end up swapping out elements in the DOM, those new elements are not wired up. Okay? So when you say live, you're saying, now internally exactly how jQuery does it, I'm not sure. You can probably look on Stack Overflow to see how they do it, whether or not they're catching whether something is being added to the DOM, whether or not they're looking at, you know, the parent item that gets clicked on, I don't know. I just know that it works. Okay? So live says this selector, okay, this selector, if it's now or if it's in the future, it's still going to end up getting wired up. And this is very helpful for a page where your DOM is going to be changing and you want the new elements to end up getting wired up.
jQuery is awesome.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. I mean, I don't know if this feature wasn't there at the beginning. I mean, before, you might have had to wire this up again at this point, which was also pretty doable. But this works pretty well. And now, if you go back and test this out, and I actually did plan on doing this because you could see in my notes it actually was step 4. So if I go back here and I test this out, and I say, you know, there's a number of different ways you could do it. If I remove, I could add back in, and it works pretty good. Okay. It's 7:26. Why don't we take like a 10-minute break? When we get back, we'll look at adding some of these. One of the things, by the way, that we lost is our message. So we're going to have to look at it, getting our message back as well.